Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Wenda Millard, Vice Chairman of Charleston Literary Festival, and it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce this session, The Wolves of K Street, and to welcome to the stage authors Brody and Luke Mullins, along with their interlocutor, Monica Langley. We are most appreciative of you, our audience, and to all who support our festival. It goes without saying, this would not be possible without you, but I will say it anyway. We are especially grateful to our donors and sponsors whose financial generosity allows us to bring this world-class program to you. This session's sponsors are Bonnie and Peter McCausland. We are very happy to welcome Peter as a new board member of Charleston Literary Festival. Lee and John McNary are also sponsors this evening. Lee is a valued board member as well and a longtime festival supporter and enthusiast. Thank you so much. Behold the squalor of influence peddling. The Wolves of K Street, a book James B. Stewart, our friend from last year, calls a not-so-guilty pleasure, is a dazzling and infuriating portrait of 50 years of corporate influence in Washington. It is irresistibly dramatic, spectacularly timely, explosive in its revelations, and impossible to put down. It's a book about big-time lobbyists behaving badly, very badly. Some break the law, steal from clients, or steal from their own partners. They all get rich and arrogant on the tab of wealthy corporate clients. You know some of them. Paul Manafort, Evan Morris, Tony Podesta, Roger Stone, to name a few. They throw their weight around with all the trappings you can imagine: big cigars, yachts, Porsches, mansions, private jets. And they almost all come to bad ends: sickness, suicide, prison, bankruptcy, or messy divorces. The Wolves of K Street is a meticulously researched and absorbing tale written by veteran political and business journalists, the brothers Brody and Luke Mullins. They walk us through how, in the 1970s, Washington's center of power began to shift away from elected officials in big marble buildings to a handful of savvy, handsomely paid operators who didn't answer to any fixed constituency. The cigar-chomping son of an influential congressman, an illustrious political fixer with a weakness for modern art, a Watergate-era dirty trickster, the city's favorite cocktail party host. These were the sort of men who began to run Washington. Over 4 decades, with billions of dollars at play, these lobbying dynasties enshrined in Washington a pro-business consensus that would guide the political leaders of this country, Democrats and Republicans alike. We learn how a good lobbyist could ghostwrite a bill or even secretly kill a piece of legislation supported by the president, both houses of Congress, and a majority of the American people. But nothing lasts forever. Amid a populist backlash to the soaring inequality these influence peddlers helped usher in, DC's pro-business establishment would continue to invent new ways to influence Washington. The men who'd built K Street would soon find themselves under legal scrutiny, on the verge of financial collapse, or worse. One would turn up dead behind the 18th hole of an exclusive golf club with a $1,500 bottle of wine at his feet and a bullet in his head. New York Times bestselling author Susan Page wrote, "However nefarious you think the lobbying industry is in Washington, Brody and Luke Mullins have news. It's worse." Not even during the Roaring '20s and the Gilded Age did corporate America wield so much influence. In their deeply reported, compelling new book, the Mullins brothers track how that happened and the disastrous consequences. Now let me introduce our authors and our interlocutor. In 2 decades as an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Brody Mullins wrote scores of groundbreaking stories about the intersection of business and politics, exposed numerous scandals, and prompted new laws and regulations to protect Americans against corruption by powerful government officials, lobbyists, and Wall Street traders. He was part of the team from the Journal that won the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for revealing financial conflicts of interest among officials at 50 federal agencies who bought and sold stocks of companies they were tasked with regulating. Luke Mullins is a contributing writer at POLITICO magazine, where he covers the people and institutions that control Washington's levers of power. He has been a senior writer at Washingtonian magazine, and he has also written for The Atlantic, Esquire, Mother Jones, among others. We are fortunate to have as our interlocutor for this session, Monica Langley, another new member of Charleston Festival's Literary Board, who herself spent 27 years at the Wall Street Journal, where she specialized in page-one newsmaking profiles of CEOs, billionaires, and presidential candidates. Monica Langley is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 nonfiction business books, Tearing Down the Walls and Trailblazer. She is a former executive vice president for global strategy for tech giant Salesforce and is now professor of practice at UT Haslam College of Business at her alma mater, the University of Tennessee. Let's go.
Okay, thank you all for being here. This is going to be really fun because this book is fun and chock full of great info, and she gave a lot of the good details, so that's excellent. All right. These 2 men, as you've heard, are brothers. Their last name gives it away, but they look alike too, don't they? Okay, Brody and I were at the Wall Street Journal together. He's a great investigative reporter. I always found him to be relentless and also ethical, which is wonderful. And Brody, we did a story together. Just tell them quickly what story we did together. I didn't actually do the story, but I kind of like it.
Well, you had a major inspiration. You were sort of the inspiration for it. So in 2007, I got a tip that Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign back then was getting possibly illegal campaign contributions from a Chinese immigrant out in San Francisco. And I came to you with the tip, I think, one Friday afternoon around 3 p.m. And you said, "What are you talking to me about? Get on a plane and get to San Francisco." And 6 hours later, I landed and found the story.
Exactly. Well, here's the deal. This was before there were like Google Maps where you could actually see the house. And this was like a Chinese immigrant that was the biggest bundler for Hillary.
Right.
And there was this address, and I'm like, what the hell are you telling me this about? Get to the house. And what was the house when you arrived?
It was a tiny 1-story green, I think 2-bedroom, 750 square feet.
In like a slum.
House. Yeah, that was really a dump, I should say. And it turned out that what we saw is that of all the addresses in America, including big addresses on Wall Street where Goldman Sachs is located or JP Morgan, that this house produced more donations for Hillary Clinton than anyone else. And sort of as soon as we saw the house, we knew like this is a scandal, and it was.
Okay, so now Luke, I didn't know before, even though he's the younger brother of Brody, but I always knew his stories because he's a well-known feature writer for the Washingtonian magazine, which I love to get his stories because they were so well written and they're page turners. So then if y'all haven't yet read The Wolves of K Street, you'll see it's a combo of these 2 brothers. The best nonfiction business books read like fiction. So they read like a novel, and that's the way this book is. It's so well reported, but you can't help but turn the page because it's like a novel. So what was it like, first question, to work together as brothers? I'm sure you all, as kids growing up, I'm sure you had your share of fights and stuff like that. So what happened here?
So it turns out that all those fights that we got in as young boys made a great experience for writing together because we'd get in those fights, but we knew how to recover very quickly. I would say that almost within minutes or hours of getting in some knockdown, drag-out fight about some chapter or some word or whatever we're fighting about, one of us or the other would call the other one and say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Mom never told me she loved me more than you. That was a lie.
But, but like at a Christmas dinner, for example, did you take the fight to Christmas dinner?
No, I don't think we ever went public with that kind of stuff.
Until now.
You didn't say,
Until now.
Dad, Brody's
Yeah.
being really bad to me. No?
No, I mean, most of it was great fun. There were some very serious fights, but we did. You tell the other person how you feel, and you apologize.
The book is fun, actually.
Yeah.
All right, let's start with the title. Okay, The Wolves of K Street. Do most of you all know what K Street is? Okay. Let's just start.
Yeah.
What is K Street?
So-
for those who don't know,
Yeah, K
in
Street
Washington.
is a street in Washington. Now it's a fairly well-traveled boulevard that during the late 70s and 1980s started to attract a lot of lobbying firms would sort of locate their headquarters there. So over time, it just became shorthand for the lobbying industry in the same way that Wall Street is shorthand for the financial industry in New York.
And Pierre L'Enfant actually devised K Street.
That is true. Yeah.
It's the biggest boulevard
widest,
in
yeah.
Washington. I lived in Washington D.C. for many years myself,
Yeah.
and it was devised for the horse-drawn carriages.
Correct.
So it's such a big boulevard.
Yeah.
And that's
it is a flagship street.
Yeah.
And
the lobbyists took it over.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the genesis of the book. Is there a story about a particular lobbyist, you two, that actually was the beginning of this book? What led to The Wolves of K Street?
So I had been a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for almost 20 years covering lobbying and industry, basically writing about how companies come to Washington and try to get what they want out of DC by hiring lobbyists and making campaign donations. And during that time, Monica was my editor for several years. And in 2015, I heard about a very young, prominent, up-and-coming Democratic lobbyist who was found dead on a golf course, as we mentioned in the introduction. And as Monica knows, when you cover a beat and someone who you cover is found dead, there's a potential story there. So I started looking into it. I went to my editor at the time, who said, "Hey, just because a lobbyist has died, in this case of suicide, no matter how dramatic it is or how sad it is, it's not necessarily a story for the Wall Street Journal. We're a big national business newspaper, so unless this death can be connected to something that national readers will care about, it's not a story for us." So that was enough for me to start reporting and trying to figure out who this guy was. It turns out his name was Evan Morris. He was a big-time lobbyist for Genentech. If you know that firm, is a big biotech company outside of San Francisco. I was looking into him, and he made a ton of money. He was an incredibly successful lobbyist. He spent a lot of money. And in me trying to figure out more about him, I found out that he owned, among other expensive toys, a $300,000 mahogany wood speedboat. I found out there's only one company in the country that makes speedboats like that. It's a Hackercraft company based in Lake George, New York. So I called up the company. It's small enough that the president of the company answered the phone. And you may remember this. I'm sort of a reporter at big time Wall Street Journal. I'm trying to get information from this small town guy, and I'm trying to not intimidate him. So I'm asking sort of very soft questions leading to what's this guy Evan Morris like, and how do you know him? And this guy caught on to me right away, and he said, what are you calling me about? I knew everything about Evan Morris, and when the FBI called me, I gave him everything, and I'm not talking to you. And he hung up on me. And I thought,
the FBI called.
The FBI called, right. So once I knew the FBI was looking into him, I knew there was some sort of a story there for the Wall Street Journal. And it turned out, the more I looked into this guy, and then once I teamed up with Luke, what we realized is that the story of this guy's life, his rise in DC, how he became so prominent in DC, how he made so much money, and then ultimately his crash in DC was a great narrative for how Washington has changed, how companies came to power in DC, how lobbying has changed. And to borrow from Jim Stewart and his great book, we started with this dead body on a golf course as a way to bring readers into a story that's really about corporate power and lobbying and campaign finance, topics that can be dense and difficult to get through. So we sort of start with, bam, a great narrative, a dead body on a golf course. We sort of tell this guy's story, which teaches people about how Washington has changed.
And that's the opening of the book. is you have a suicide on a golf course with wine and an expensive bottle of wine, and you don't find out. You've got to read more than half the damn book to find out who actually killed himself.
It's supposed
on
to
the
be a
golf
mystery, but not anymore.
Yeah, but now you all know. But it was like, I couldn't take it. I'm like, who killed himself on the golf course?
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Now, so that is a great intro, and you have some intrigue and suspense, but then he was one of the first kind of first lobbyists of that age. But then, who was the first lobbyist of the modern age?
Yeah. So, our book kind of covers, most of the book lives in this 40-year period between, the early 1970s up to, today, really Trump's first victory now. And we start with a guy by the name of Tommy Boggs as sort of quintessential kind of old school lobbyist. He sort of represents the way that lobbying used to work. So in terms of like whatever your vision is of a lobbyist, it's Tommy Boggs, right? He's sort of this old fashioned, cigar chomping, did a lot of business in smoke filled rooms over drinks. He himself, his father had been an influential member of Congress, and he sort of, was able to wield his influence, a lot of it through sort of these personal connections that his family had developed over time. He was on good terms with a lot of influential Democrats who had been running Washington for about 50 years at that point. So we sort of start with him to kind of show the way that lobbying used to work. And he's a good starting point, which we then move forward to show sort of how lobbying has changed over the following decades.
Sure. Tell us a little bit about, like, one of his best things that he did. One story that I really liked in the book was how he did the national nanny story. Do you know what I mean? That because you have a line in there where he's telling people, why litigate when we can legislate? As if he can just change the laws on behalf of his corporate clients.
Right. He did.
So
how did he do it?
Yeah. So essentially, this was, I want to say, like 1972 or around then, and sort of at this time, we now think of corporations as sort of being in power in Washington, but back then it was really unions, consumer groups, public interest groups. The sort of corporate lobbying establishment, was really sort of on the defensive at that point, and there was a lot of legislation being imposed upon them that they weren't happy about. And one of the things that Tommy Boggs did was he was able to sort of unite industries that sort of hadn't worked with each other into these sort of broader coalitions. And one specific issue was, there was an issue of, it was called KidVid, and it was essentially, there was an FTC chairman at that time who was very aggressive, and one of the things he wanted to do was crack down on television advertising that was directed for sugary cereals to children. And he thought, gosh, this is bad. We have all this tooth decay. This is bad for public health. And Tommy Boggs was representing one of the cereal companies, General Mills, I believe. Mm-hmm. But he also understood that there's lots of other players that were also going to be harmed, including the television companies and some of these other food companies. And so he kind of got them all together. But one of the things that he did was do a lot of research, and he sort of came up with the phrase that if you're going to be preventing companies from advertising the way that you want to advertise, you're essentially becoming a national nanny, right? That was his sort of catchphrase. And he sent materials, including that phrase, to the Washington Post, and it was Meg Greenwell, one of their sort of, signature op-ed writers, took that material and found it persuasive, and wrote this op-ed where she branded the FTC as the national nanny. And from there, it really took off. Nanny State, it all kind of, it sort of, that's sort of the origin point there. And it becomes really powerful. Like, it really undercut the FTC's argument in the minds of the public and eventually the members of Congress.
I mean, it was like, the FTC is coming after your M&Ms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, I mean, as this the business community started using these lobbyists. I mean, before you had like Ralph Nader and
Right.
labor unions and the consumer groups and Nader and the environmental groups had more power.
Correct.
And suddenly it started turning
Right.
where, as you all document in the book, over time, these lobbyists
Yeah.
got more money. They had more money from business
Yeah.
community, and then they outmaneuvered
Yeah, I mean, one of the
so-called do-gooders.
Exactly. One of the really important inflection points is in 1978, the amount of money that businesses were providing Democrats was eclipsed. The amount of money that unions were providing Democrats was eclipsed by the amount of money that business groups were providing Democrats. And a lot of that had to do with sort of the manufacturing industry is in decline. But, unions had been the sort of financial ballast of the Democratic Party for, 50, 60 years or longer prior to that. And, once the sort of base of finances change, then the priorities of the Democratic Party starts to change. So that's a really important
One
hinge
thing
point.
to add, just to rewind for a little history, is that from the antitrust era, when the antitrust laws were created in the progressive era in the early 1900s, to the 1970s, companies had very little influence in Washington.
Right.
We went from the New Deal to the Great Society. The federal government, grew by leaps and bounds. All sorts of new agencies, departments, and not just by Democrats. I mean, we forget that the EPA was created by Richard Nixon. So both Republicans and Democrats for that period believed that the government should get bigger in order to protect its citizens and regulate companies. And what we write about is how that started to change starting in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Okay, so then how did lobbying change since then, since Tommy Boggs? What changed, Brody?
Yeah, so we write about two things. One is how companies became so powerful in DC, again, starting in the 1970s to now. And we also write about how their tactics changed during that time in order to maintain and grow their influence. We start with Tommy Boggs, who we consider the inside game. And back in a time when a few members of Congress controlled Washington, and the president, and a good lobbyist like Tommy Boggs, who knew a few people in Washington, could get things done for clients. Now Washington, after Watergate, has gotten much bigger, much more complex. So many more members of Congress are committee chairmen or subcommittee chair. In fact, we have a joke in the book, or Tommy Boggs made a joke, that after Watergate, when power was moved from the White House to committees, to Congress and to committees and subcommittees, that when Tommy Boggs would go up to Capitol Hill and yell, "Hey, Mr. Chairman," half the people would turn around because most people on Capitol Hill were the subcommittee chairman of this or committee chairman of that. And that meant that lobbying had to change. Tommy Boggs couldn't get by just knowing a few people. You need to know lots of people. Another evolution in lobbying, which we really focused on, is called the outside game, which means that, so I've been a reporter in Washington for 25 years, let's say, and the one thing I know for sure is that a member of Congress will do whatever their constituents want. They exist to get reelected, and therefore they're very in tune with what their constituents want. Constituents being, you guys, voters. So and so lobbyists know this. So what lobbyists have tried to do is, instead of going to Capitol Hill and trying to get favors and sweetheart deals from members of Congress, is they go out to the states and they try to get, and states and districts, they try to get regular voters, regular Americans fired up about some issue, a trade or a tax bill or whatnot. And if a member of Congress thinks that their constituents are for a trade bill or for a tariff, they're going to follow. A great example of this is back to Evan Morris, the dead body on the golf course. In 2007, I believe it was, he was working for a company called Roche Pharmaceuticals. Roche is a Swiss pharmaceutical company, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies and oldest in the world. They make 1 million different drugs, including Tamiflu, which everyone knows about. In 2007, Evan Morris was their top lobbyist in DC. I think he was 26 years old, something like that. And he heard about, everyone remembers the avian bird flu. Back then, there were news stories that the avian bird flu was killing people overseas. It might come to the United States. It might kill people here. Evan Morris seized on that. He hired media consultants to go out into the states and to write write blogs in the conservative media or the liberal media, trying to get people worried about the avian bird flu. Those constituents, those voters, then wrote to their members of Congress or contacted members of Congress and said, "Hey, we need to do something about this." In October 2007, 32 Senate Democrats wrote a letter to the Bush administration saying, "The avian bird flu is coming. We're unprepared. The U.S. needs to do something about it. We need to create a stockpile of medications or treatments if the avian bird flu comes here. Among those,
And this was all orchestrated by
all
Evan Morris.
behind the scenes. This is not an organic thing that happened. Evan Morris did this. Don't steal my punchline here. So Evan Morris. So on this letter, these 32 Senate Democrats included Senator Barack Obama, Senator Hillary Clinton, Senator Joe Biden. I mean, these were the heavyweights of the Democratic Party going to the Bush administration saying, let's create a stockpile. The Bush administration responded by allocating $2 billion to create a stockpile for treatments for the avian bird flu. Once that's out there, Evan Morris, the lobbyist for Roche, says, oh, by the way, my company makes Tamiflu, the only treatment there is for the avian bird flu. So the government buys $2 billion worth of Tamiflu. And that's sort of how lobbying has changed. And obviously that was a total scandal, but that is that's sort of how lobbying works now, where members of Congress want to respond to their constituents, so lobbyists sort of go out to try to get their constituents. And if we go to DC right now and find our way to some closet at the Department of Homeland Security or something, we'll find a closet full of $2 billion worth of
That was never
Tamiflu.
actually used.
Right, never used, and certainly
But-
expired, and probably they've bought new ones to replace their expired ones. And
I love the last the last sentence in that chapter. You wrote, because he was able to get all that Tamiflu bought by the federal government, lobbying had become a profit center.
Yeah.
that was Luke's line. He wrote that.
Well, that's one of the other.
You wrote that line?
Well, it's one of the
Great
other.
line.
Thank you. Well, that's one of the other big transitions, right, over the past 40 years is that, in the 70s and 80s, when businesses were on the defensive, a lot of lobbying tactics were about sort of blocking unwanted legislation or sort of creating, promoting legislation that was going to be helpful. These days, lobbying really has become sort of an extension of commerce in a sense.
It's part of the strategy.
It's a way
of
to
the company.
drive. It's a way to drive revenue.
As someone who did global strategy for Salesforce, I'm like, I admired that.
Yeah.
What he did, that was good strategy.
Yeah, you can drive revenue through government contracts. Another thing is, expanding market share through antitrust. Some of these big companies, they can really only grow through Washington right now. So that's, and again, we get back to the way that lobbying, lobbying is obviously constitutionally protected, and we want businesses to be engaging with government about creating an economy that sort of works for everyone. But the sort of lobbying was sort of never supposed to be driving profits or expanding market share, right?
Exactly.
So that's sort of where we
Someone
got to
who read this book and found out I was going to be talking to you said, this is legal fraud. How can this happen? I was very upset about it. But how did you all report out this book? This is filled with so much investigative nuggets and amazing detail, as well as being just so well written. How did you report out the book to get this much detail and investigative stuff that's never been revealed before?
Sure.
From, I'm sure, people who did not want it out.
Yeah, so we have 5 main characters. 2 are dead, and the other 3 didn't want to talk to us. So that.
So there you go.
Well, but as you know, as a longtime investigative reporter, that presents great opportunities. Because people wouldn't talk to us, we had to work harder, and we had to talk to their ex-wives and their former employees and their college roommates and their neighbors, and on and on and on.
And people they fired who hate them now.
Exactly. So in the case of Tony Podesta, Tony Podesta ran a 100-person lobbying firm in DC. A few days after he was sort of named in the Robert Mueller indictment of Paul Manafort, his firm collapsed, and that meant that 99 people wanted to talk to us, which was helpful. So everyone refused to talk to us until the very end. Once our book was almost fully reported and mostly written, we went to Tony Podesta. If you remember him, Tony Podesta is the brother of John Podesta, who was probably one of the most important Democrats in DC. He ran Hillary Clinton's campaign. He was Barack Obama's chief of staff. He was big in the Clinton administration also. And Tony Podesta was his brother and sort of capitalized off of that to create this huge lobbying firm. Tony Podesta was probably the most important unelected Democrat in DC for 20 years. Anyway, at some point, once we were sort of done all our reporting, talking to 100, 200 people in Tony Podesta's world, I texted him and said, "Hey, Tony, my name is Brody Mullins. I'm writing this book about lobbying. It's largely about you. You're not going to like it.
You're not gonna like it.
You know, but you're 80 years old. No one's ever going to write a book about you again. And if you want to talk, let's talk." And 5 minutes later, he called and said, "Come on down." And Luke and I spent a lot of time with him, hearing his stories. And at that point, he sort of knew we knew everything about him.
Exactly. That's what happens.
And he wanted to sort of explain himself. And he told us great stories that we didn't know about.
Yeah.
And in fact, we found him to be one of the things our editor wanted was us to find some humanity in these characters, because they're all kind of bad dudes. And in Tony Podesta, we really found that. Do you want to?
I mean, so he was human, I would say, right? Like in the sense that, in the sense
They all have some amount of human.
No, I don't mean that facetiously. Like it was very sad, right? Like this had been a guy who had been this, very important person in Washington for most of his life, and he physically was not in good shape, and he also had this very high profile divorce, which we write about in the book
With Heather.
with Heather Podesta, this sort of explosive
Just
sort
as
of
a side,
tabloid.
guess who just sent me an email today?
Oh, really?
Heather Podesta.
Yeah.
Who's still surviving, has a thriving practice.
Beyond surviving, right? Like she won.
She's thriving,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
she just sent me an email as I was coming here, inviting me to breakfast at the Four Seasons
Okay,
in
that's-
D.C. in
that's
the
where she
morning
has
with
breakfast.
guess who? Kellyanne Conway,
Okay.
talking about landing on her feet.
Wow, yeah.
She still thinks I have some kind of clout in
Yeah,
D.C.
right.
No, but nevertheless.
Yeah. No.
Well, we'll be at the table next door, I
Right.
think.
But-
Y'all, take my invite. Go in the morning, but you're
Definitely.
going to have fun in Charleston.
But Tony Podesta, he was talking about how people. It was Nancy Pelosi, people that he had always been a longtime donor for. Nancy Pelosi, he came to Tony Podesta's mother's funeral, and now they were calling him, basically rejecting his donation, saying, "Hey, we don't want this money from you." There was also his then girlfriend, now wife. He said he had met her at a wedding, and he said at that wedding someone had told this woman, "Hey, do not. This guy. He's bad news. Like, don't spend time with him." There was like a lot. It was absolutely human in the sense
Did you
that it was
shed
sad.
a tear?
No, definitely not. But I mean, it was interesting. Like I could see a lot of these lobbyists, they have this charisma and they have this sort of magnetic part of them, and that I could see through
I get you.
through his stories. But also this sadness was what I.
But one person that you all went after, who's a big character, I read it in your epilogue. One of the lobbyists called you all, or one of you, an effing moron who lives in Shittsville, works in a cubicle, and takes Metro, and you'll never equal his largesse. So poor, pitiful you reporters, authors.
Right. So that was a guy named Jim Kordovich, who was actually lived in Sullivan's Island for many years.
He what?
He had bought a house in Sullivan's Island.
Yeah.
And my wife and I went last night to the Obstinate Daughter, which is very, it's this great restaurant. And that restaurant is in the book because there's a scene there sort of during Jim's sort of downfall. He has a moment, where he basically, he was a regular at this bar, and he got like in a car accident on the way out, and then sort of ran, and like the police station is right across the street. So he's like,
They caught him because they looked at the police station video cam, and like there it was around.
All right, let's go to the here and the now. Okay, with Trump's win yesterday, who will be the most powerful lobbyist in this new administration?
Yeah, so this is sort of a crazy story.
Who's also in your book?
Yeah. So
quite a bit.
Of the 5 characters, we talk about Tommy Boggs, our original lobbyist. We talk about Tony Podesta. We talk about Jim Kordovich of Sullivan's Island, and then another is Paul Manafort. So Paul Manafort worked on the 1980 Ronald Reagan presidential campaign. Reagan is actually very similar to Trump in that. We forget this, but Reagan was an outsider when he ran for president. He was running first in 1976 against the incumbent president, then Gerald Ford. Then he ran against George Bush in 1980, who was the Eastern establishment Republican when that was the Republican Party, and Reagan was this outsider. Cut a year forward, Reagan wins. People in D.C. businesses didn't know Reagan. They didn't have connection with him. He wasn't from D.C. And companies wanted to have influence with Reagan, and they looked around and realized that Paul Manafort had worked on his campaign. Paul Manafort and this name Roger Stone, a guy named Charlie Black, and Lee Atwater, if you remember his name, from South Carolina. Those four formed a lobbying firm. They were 20, 29, 31 years old at the time. They knew Reagan. They said, hey, we can become lobbyists. And sure enough, all these companies hired, and business people hired that firm because they knew Reagan. Another thing to remember is that in 1980, Democrats hadn't had a majority in the House or Senate for many years at that point. The former Republican lobbyists who were close with Nixon left Washington with Nixon. So there were no Republican figures, so these four became sort of the leading lobbyists of the 1980s. What's interesting is that Paul Manafort realized that access, those relationships, mean you can become a huge lobbyist. So Black, Manafort, and Stone, who you wrote several stories about when you were at the Journal, became the most popular, the most successful, the most sought after lobbying firm of the 1980s. They represented Salomon Brothers and TWA and Carl Icahn and Rupert Murdoch and even Donald Trump. Cut to the 2016 election. Paul Manafort is then working in Ukraine. He's sort of out of the DC lobbying business, and he realizes he wants to get back into lobbying. And he sees Donald Trump, who looked a lot like Ronald Reagan. Here's an outsider running against all these established figures. Manafort works for his campaign. He gets sidelined by these investigations into Ukraine and Russia. So he ultimately he goes to jail. When Trump wins, Manafort...
But wait, he was part of the Trump campaign.
Yes,
he's the chairman.
I mean, I covered the Trump campaign in 2015, and I broke the story for the Wall Street Journal when he was fired as the campaign manager because he was causing too much trouble.
Ukraine stuff.
Do you know what I mean?
So we argue in our book that he became the campaign chairman because he was trying to re-engage his lobbying
exactly. But then he was fired as the campaign
to be clear,
manager.
He was in a financial collapse, and he joined the campaign in order to then become a lobbyist, right? Like most
exactly.
Right, like most people that join a campaign, they want to go into the White House and they want to get some hotshot job. He had done that before, and also he was really in dire straits financially. His goal that whole time was, hey, I'm going to get Trump elected so that I can then start a foreign lobbying firm, have access to Trump, and get out of this hole. And he ends up, that would have worked, except he gets caught up in the Mueller scandal and ends up going to prison.
And he went to prison for money
laundering.
But
now he is going to get his payoff.
Right.
And then he got a presidential pardon before Trump left office.
So what we know about Donald Trump for sure is that he values loyalty above anything else. And by my count, there's 3 people who've gone to jail for Donald Trump, Paul Manafort being first on that list. And we are sure that Paul Manafort is now going to say, I'm a lobbyist again, and all these companies are going to hire him because he's got Trump's ear.
And he showed up in Milwaukee this summer.
Well, he tried to get, right.
So I agree with you guys. Actually. Okay, so let's ask this. Are companies as powerful as you have shown they were in this 40-year history? Are they going to be as powerful?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating topic. So Luke and I wrapped up the reporting and writing this book about 2 years ago, and the book again is about the rise of corporate power in DC, and we realized that all of a sudden in the last couple of years, companies are a little bit less influential than they were for most of the previous 50 years. And what we've seen is that there's an increasing number of anti-corporate Democrats, and we see the AOCs, and we see Elizabeth Warren talking more and more about how companies should be regulated more. But more importantly to me is I see a change in the Republican Party, in that there's more and more Republicans who think these companies have gotten too big, too powerful, too influential, particularly the tech companies, but also others. And Republicans who we spoke to for this book, including J.D. Vance. We sat down with J.D. Vance 2 years ago, and J.D. Vance said concentrated economic power is as bad or worse than government power. And this is something that you'd expect Elizabeth Warren to say, but this is J.D. Vance, who...
And do you all think, I mean, a lot of what people are saying today with the Trump victory is that it's considered much of the populists are there, and there's J.D. Vance is the VP elect.
Yeah, it remains to be seen because, yes, they have sort of ridden this populist wave, but Trump is also very transactional. And, you know, what was the bite dance, or what was the TikTok, TikTok hired Kellyanne Conway as well as some others in order to get to him, and he, flips his
But let me give you just a couple data points. So what we've seen is an increasing number of Republicans who are signing on to anti-corporate bills with Democrats. And Josh Hawley is a good example. Everyone remembers Josh Hawley, the very conservative Republican from Missouri. He has 3 bills, sort of pro-worker, anti-corporate bills right now. One that would ban banks from getting executives at banks from getting bonuses if the banks fail. Yeah. Another would make it easier for workers to join labor unions. A third that would cap debit card fees. All those bills he's co-sponsoring are written with Elizabeth Warren, because some of those far right folks and some of the far left folks are coming together. My second data point is I did a study for the Wall Street Journal where I looked at the 100 poorest congressional districts, and I looked at who represent them, were they represented by Republican or Democrat. And I looked at the 2022 election and then 10 years early in the 2012 election. And the 2012 election, if you took the 100 poorest districts, 63 were represented by Democrats. And that's what you would think is like poor urban districts represented by Democrats. This is how politics has worked for my entire life. In the 2022 election, those numbers were exactly reversed. In the 2022 election, of the 100 poorest districts, 63 were represented by Republicans. And to me, that shows that the Republican Party is changing. This is not the Ronald Reagan Republican Party, the big business Republican Party. These are people who represent poor, working class, rural whites, and I think that's where the party is going. More anti-corporate and more pro-worker.
Interesting.
But it's even broader than that. Like, a lot of our book is sort of about these coalitions that kind of held what we think of as this sort of pro-business consensus together. But if you want to look at labor unions, right? Like labor unions, like the Teamsters, declined to endorse Kamala Harris, right? This was it's a pretty radical thing in the if you were looking at the way these coalitions operated over the past 40 years. So like a lot of these things are sort of coming unglued, and we don't know exactly how it's all going to shake out, but it's pretty dramatic changes in terms of I want to
ask y'all one more question before we go to audience questions. How will Elon Musk roll in the Trump administration? Because he's going to be head of efficiency or some crazy kind of thing. I'm not sure, but he definitely will have a role. How will he impact the lobbying industry? So the ultimate question is, will the wolves of K Street continue winning somehow, some way?
Yeah. So the wolves of K Street always win, for starters. What is Elon Musk going to do? What is Donald Trump going to do? Obviously, we have no idea. Things can change at any moment. But if it's true that Elon Musk is going to run this Department of Efficiency, where his job is to cut government spending, what I would suspect is that the companies that benefit from that spending, or the industries that benefit from that spending, are going to hire lobbyists who are going to come to Washington. Lobbyists are experts in how Washington works, how the bureaucracy works, how these very complicated bills become laws and various policies. So they know how to sort of gum up the works. So Elon Musk can say, I'm going to cut $1 billion from this and $2 billion from that. But the lobbyists know how to go to their friends in Congress to stop Congress from enacting whatever cuts Elon Musk wants. So I think this will be really good for the lobbying business.
So the wolves will still, they will still roam, and they will still succeed. Okay, all right, let's take some questions. I hope y'all have some. If not, we can keep talking. Raise your hand and wait for a microphone, please. Okay, let's go. Okay, we have one right here with a microphone. Stand up, please. Ask your question.
Did you find in your reporting any concept of transferring from K Street to the tarmacs of state capitals in terms of the multinationals just getting on a jet and knocking out 3 state capitals in a day or something like that?
Generally speaking, given how sort of gridlocked Congress has been, like a lot of the lobbying action is happening in the states right now. There's just much more that lobbyists can do. So we don't get into state level lobbying in the book, but it is certainly the case that a lot of these big companies are spending a lot of resources there and getting more done. Yeah.
So,
sorry.
Thank you. With President-elect Trump's second time around now, having gone through Washington once in the lobby.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, sorry. The second time around now, President-elect Trump, how do you think he'll approach his interactions with the lobbyists?
Yeah.
Will he be more, say, suspicious of them? Would he be more receptive to them? But I think that second time around now, he has somewhat of, having that experience and some time. I also think about how the lobbyists are going to approach him beyond, Manafort.
Right.
And remember, when he ran the first time, he said he was going to drain the swamp,
Right.
Precisely.
which is the lobbyist.
Right.
That's what he was
Does
after.
he still want to do that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so the first time around, Trump essentially had no connection to the existing K Street establishment. So what you saw were anyone who could plausibly claim to have some connection to Trump sort of reinvented themselves as a corporate lobbyist. This time around, there are just so many, he now has all of these former cabinet officials, cabinet undersecretaries that are no longer in government. Some of them may come back in the government, but the rest of them presumably are going to be some type of lobbyist and strategist. And what we do know about Trump is that he tends to respond sort of in an old-fashioned way in terms of, people that know him and can have a direct relationship with him. He will listen to them, and that's the best way to actually sort of get something done. A lot of lobbying over the past 40 years had sort of moved away from that, but Trump personal relationships, and now there are just so many more people who have worked with him in Washington. So I imagine that there will be sort of this new cast of characters that will reinvent themselves, and he will listen to them. Yeah.
Okay, do we have another question?
Over here. I'm very interested in how journalism is influenced by business. And since you guys are have been with the Wall Street Journal, I'd like to know what you think about News Corp's influence on the Wall Street Journal.
So, great question for two of us. So
Wait, what was the question?
Does Rupert Murdoch and News Corp try to influence the Wall Street Journal? So, the Wall Street Journal is a more conservative paper. Certainly the editorial side is more conservative. And I think it's because we cover business, and business is more conservative. In my entire time as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, which would be 20 total years, I think 15 with Rupert Murdoch, I never once saw, Rupert Murdoch never emailed me. He never said, hey, write about this, write about that, with two sort of weird exceptions. He never contacted me, but I think sometimes editors wanted me to write certain things because they thought that Rupert Murdoch would want it. So, but I don't know if he ever spoke. I think it was more indirect. And secondly, and I didn't realize it until later, Rupert Murdoch and News Corp and Google and the tech industry are huge opponents. And I happened to write a lot of negative stories about Google. And every time I wrote a negative story about Google, I'd get an email from Rupert Murdoch saying, great story. But it wasn't ahead of time. It wasn't write this story sort of afterwards.
I was with the Wall Street Journal for 27 years, and I never felt any pressure or influence by Rupert Murdoch except one time. When he bought the Wall Street Journal, we first thought he was the devil, from having been owned by a family that did it. But I found he made really positive changes to the Wall Street Journal, except taking away the dot drawings, which we all loved, to put real photographs in the paper. The one change that he made, I was Brody's boss briefly as the deputy bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. So he invited all the bureau chiefs when he bought the paper to a dinner. And I came off the campaign trail having just profiled Mitt Romney. This was whenever the year he bought the paper. And I came in late to the dinner. And I said, I'm sorry I'm late. I just came off the campaign trail. I wrote the page 1 profile today of Mitt Romney. And he's like, are you Monica Langley? I'm like, yes, sir. And I was like so meek walking in. I thought, what the shit is he going to say to me? And he goes, I love your work. He goes, why are you an editor? I demote you from editor. You go back being a reporter. And I'm like, praise God. I don't want to be an editor. I want to be on the trail. That's the only thing he ever did. So I was like actually his boss for like 2 months. So I never wanted to be an editor. I loved reporting. And that's how I always did the page one stories of presidential candidates and CEOs and billionaires. So that's the only influence he ever had on me, and it was so positive. I adored him, but he never did anything else to me. You have to have a microphone.
Hey, over here.
Here's somebody in the front if we can get this person a microphone. Go ahead.
There's another sibling duo, actually, that is talking about influence in D.C. It's Callie and Casey Means, a Stanford-trained doctor, and Callie Means has been a lobbyist, K Street lobbyist. And they're out talking about the influence of pharma and ag and the foods, what we're eating. Senator Ron Johnson hosted a roundtable recently. They also brought RFK Jr. and others in, and now we've seen, they're really taking on business and the influence, the money they're spending on studies and all of this, right? So really ties in very closely with what you're talking about. Then with RFK and now Trump winning and what he's, along with Elon Musk, kind of coming in, have you tracked any of this at all? I mean, it was interesting that Atlantic reported on this roundtable discussion, the woo-woo caucus. And so really, the media really didn't report on it kind of outside of that. I'm really curious to see if there's this, within the Trump administration, these very interesting people taking on business and the influence of lobbyists, and if you're tracking that at all, and if not, I'm just curious how that all shakes out.
Yeah, I think that goes to what we were talking about earlier with the rise of the populist wing of the Republican Party, and are therefore companies losing a little influence? And it seems like they are. I mean, that's what I hear more and more, is that Republicans think that these big companies have gotten too big and powerful. I mean, look at pharma. Pharma, since literally 1950, has been the most influential industry in Washington. Speaking of Kennedy, Senator John F. Kennedy in 1950 was involved in hearings with pharmaceutical companies trying to rein in the cost of drug prices. Washington did nothing about that until just last year, when Biden had some small limits on 7 drugs or something like that. That's how influential pharma has been during that time. But you hear more and more Republicans who are trying to go after pharma. Donald Trump, when he was elected the first time, during the campaign, he campaigned as sort of this anti-corporate guy. Once he was elected, businesses hoped that he would go back to revert to being a normal Republican. But before he was even inaugurated, he started blasting pharma and drug prices. And then he unsuccessfully fought for 4 years to try to reduce drug prices and have, on commercials, you should have to disclose the drug price. That got shot down by a court. So I think more and more we see Republicans trying to go after those big businesses. It was pharma. Now I see more tech. Republicans and Democrats and the American public think that tech companies are too big, too influential in their lives. And I feel like now that Trump is president and someone like J.D. Vance with him, I think they're really going to keep focusing on tech.
Okay,
but we also see, just to name one other thing, Republicans also talk about grocery store mergers and railroads and airlines and big banks. I mean, they're talking about, some Republicans, the J.D. Vance, are talking about all these industries being too big and too consolidated.
We have a question in the front.
Yeah, so I'd be curious, could you talk about ways lobbyists actually influence members of Congress and Supreme Court justices beyond just donating to their campaign? I worked on the Hill during Koreagate, where they just brought them briefcases of cash. But with what came to light about Clarence Thomas, I mean, there are clearly other things they're doing that let them pile up net worth and influence them.
Yeah. So we try to focus on corporate lobbying of Congress, really, and the White House. We try to stay clear of the judiciary. We try to stay clear of the states, maybe for follow-up books. It's now pre the 1980s. There were scandals when members of Congress were being paid in cash. I mean, it's always been illegal to bribe a member of Congress. Was then, is now. That's illegal. What we have now is basically legalized bribery, which is you can't give a member of Congress a bag of cash. But you can say, hey, let's go on a fundraising trip and go play golf, and I can give you $5,000 from my corporate political fundraising account to your reelection, that's totally legal. You can give $10,000 to a member of Congress's to their political fundraising committee. So there's all sorts of ways where if it's not money going directly to you, but going to your political funds, then all of a sudden it becomes legal. If you remember the name Jack Abramoff, he was the big lobbying scandal of the 2000s. Congress responded in the 2000s to the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal by passing a gift ban, which said that a member of Congress can't give anything of value to a lawmaker or a public official. And two things happened when we passed that law. One is that the law only applied to lobbyists. So lots of lobbyists said, oh, I'm no longer a lobbyist. Now I'm a strategist or a consultant or I'm something else, so the law doesn't apply. And the other thing we saw, and actually Jack Abramoff said this, was, well, you don't just make everything a fundraiser. As long as you're giving something to the member of Congress as part of fundraising, it's all completely legal. And it still is. And so it's really legalized bribery.
And we have another question here, if we can get a microphone.
You talked about towards the end of the book how one of the strategies to try to appeal to Trump was like, I think you called it influence on one, where they try to take out ads in Fox and Friends and magazines and stuff like that. This is kind of a big question. If you were to advise this nascent organized labor movement, for lack of a better way of putting it, from the Amazon union to the Teamsters about the best way to influence the Trump administration, to lobby them, what would you advise them to do?
I mean, what we learned through that episode there in 2016 is, initially Trump comes into Washington. He has no connection to the existing lobbying establishment, so folks were sort of throwing stuff on the wall, against the wall, trying to find out what works. There's a lot of quirky stuff, like you mentioned, sort of sending ads, serving ads through this tactic called geofencing to try to get ads on his actual phone. Also running ads on shows they thought he was watching, like Fox and Friends. That all ended up sort of not being effective. And what ended up being effective were the handful of people that he actually knew. For example, Brian Ballard was his old lobbyist from Florida. He was one of the few actual lobbyists who had a connection with Trump. Basically just getting somebody who actually knew Trump and could get in front of him to advocate for whatever it is they wanted. That, to me, will continue to be the most effective way to do that. So if I was advising, these unions, that would be the best way. Hire, whoever is going to be the new crop of people. Hire Paul Manafort. If you're asking me, the problem is these unions. I don't know if some of them can afford Paul Manafort, right? That's the sort of imbalance issue there. But Trump, so much of our book is moving from the smoke-filled room to the sort of modern way of influencing, where you're not trying to deal with, no longer trying to talk directly to a member of Congress, but trying to get to their constituents to put pressure on the member of Congress. With Trump, it's a throwback to the smoke-filled room era. So if you can get to somebody who has credibility with Trump, Kellyanne Conway would be someone. Those are the people that you're going to have the best shot with.
So I think that's all the time we have, but I think the clear thing that we were going to have a question. We were not sure whether we would know tonight who was going to be our president. So I also had a question about, who would be the lobbyists to go to if the president were going to be Kamala Harris, or if it were going to be Donald Trump. We happened to know tonight, so we focused more on Trump. But I think it was going to be clear after talking to both Brody and Luke that ultimately corporate America would still have influence, and the lobbyists would still have influence at the expense of the American people, probably. I don't know. I think that's kind of...
Yeah, I mean, listen, our book is sort of about how when things change, lobbyists find a way to invent new rules and new tactics in order to maintain their influence, and that's what we'll expect.
So I think that will still continue, even though there's going to be some waning of the influence. The wolves of K Street will continue to prevail. And I think this book, if you haven't read it yet, you'll love reading it, because it's a fun read, and it's so educational, and you don't even know what you're learning about this history while you're reading it. So I'd like to thank Brody and Luke.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you to Brody and to Luke Mullins and to you, Monica, for just a brilliant panel, very timely and thought-provoking. Please also join me in thanking the McCauslins and the McNearys for their generous support of this session. The authors will be signing books, so you know what to do. You go out the back, you take a left, and queue up and get your book signed. Many of you have been asking about Patrick Bringley's play. If you remember last year, and you will because he was one of your absolute favorite authors, with All the Beauty in the World, we will be premiering All the Beauty in the World as the play on Friday night. Many of you have been asking about that. Unfortunately, Friday night is sold out, but we do have some tickets left for Sunday evening. So go online to our site, order your tickets, and see that play. You saw it on the front page of the arts section of the New York Times this week. And we just were absolutely delighted to have had that publicity, but we're also delighted to be chosen as the place to premiere the show. Thank you again for joining us.